Great, thanks, Matt. That was really fascinating. And just to follow up on my question, I think my conception of what's happening in a lot of these models is that there's a lot of coordinated activity happening, as a single moment of constraint satisfaction, as one iteration of processing, and then you have a lot of sequential steps happening over time, that in the transformers get kind of, parallelized. And so you're doing what takes a human kind of multiple cognitive steps, kind of all in parallel, all across these different hierarchical layers. And so I think it's pretty interesting to think about, like, how that might map on. I think it's interesting that it doesn't obviously map on to the human cognitive architecture as much as one might, have hoped, perhaps.
Yeah,
but
time is really spatialized. I agree with that.
Yeah, time is super spatialized, and so if you try to unwind all those loops some way, maybe that gives us some insight. Anyway, so here's the kind of cognitive architecture that I've been working with, for my whole career, basically, and this kind of represents, I think, a pretty broad consensus of what a lot of cognitive neuroscience people think about in terms of the core, most kind of global scale elements of the brain as they relate to various forms of cognitive function. So we've got, posterior cortex doing perception, transforming sensory information into higher level abstract representations. You've got frontal cortex providing some kind of task relevant top-down biasing to focus on relevant aspects of information coming in from sensory cortex. And you have basal ganglia playing this critical role in the center of this architecture, updating frontal cortex step by step on kind of what is it that we're going to do next. And so this is really the engine of sequential processing that allows us to kind of sequence each step of cognitive processing to achieve some overall goal. And then you have the hippocampus encoding, taking snapshots of the state of this entire system and allowing you to get back to those prior states and do pattern completion so that you can kind of retrieve some full representation from partial cues. And with all of those pieces together, you have the ability to kind of, do coordinated cognitive function. And we collaborated with the folks, Christian Lebier, principally at developing the ACT-R architecture, and really noticed that there is a very strong correspondence between what goes on in ACT-R and this kind of basic cognitive neural architecture here. And in particular, this really central role of the basal ganglia, which is like the production system in the kind of classic symbolic architectures, right? And that critical role of kind of stepping through cognitive steps over time is really central to both ideas here. And then you also have nice correspondences with hippocampus in some role in memory, although I think, it's interesting, we'll talk a little bit later about declarative memory being both semantic and episodic memory, whereas the hippocampus we think of as specifically episodic memory. Anyway, so I think there's a real nice demonstration that, all of these elements working together in this way works, right? ACT-R works. You can get this architecture to do a huge number of different tasks, and it really makes sense of a huge amount of cognitive data, and it kind of is a sufficiency proof that this really can solve these tasks. And I think it maps really well onto this kind of large scale neural architecture. So that's an exciting convergence. There's more recently been a lot of interesting work on trying to articulate a common model that includes architectures like SOAR and some other common proposed architectures. And this kind of looks like this, kind of basal ganglia being that kind of procedural long-term memory, temporal lobe, and basically including cortex and hippocampus as sort of a long-term memory system. Again, this kind of critical central role for some kind of constraint of what you're going to do now, what task you're working on, and iterating over that. And of course, sensory motor kind of processing. And I also noted that this actually resembles pretty closely the kind of modal model of memory from Atkinson and Shiffrin, a classic model. So I think there's a lot of convergence on this kind of basic kind of structure of what we think of as kind of this core models of cognition. I think there's a lot of interesting potential discussion about what declarative memory looks like, and its relationship to perception and motor, and that's kind of where I'm going to go here. Okay, so just to kind of pull out some of the other key things from that common model. This is from the paper from 2017 from John Laird et al. The idea that you have some kind of core symbolic representation is of course central to all of these architectures. Some way of representing slots and fillers, classic kinds of ideas about structured knowledge. And, Matt really talked a lot about how deep networks are trying to incorporate that same kind of structure. And this is really the key focus I want to talk about. How is that structure actually represented in the brain? And so the idea that, perception is really that point of translation between, analog stuff into this kind of more symbolic structure. And then once it's in that form, you sort of imagine the cognitive architecture sort of passing around symbols in a very kind of classic information processing sense. Okay. So I'm going to push back on that a little bit and try to articulate a bit of a different perspective that I think fits perhaps better with the structure of the brain. And this is the idea that, in fact, we have different entire lobes of the brain doing different parts of this problem, and that there aren't perhaps atomic elements of symbols, of chunks, so to speak, but rather you have the parietal lobe primarily playing the role of learning about kind of relations among kind of objects and things in the world, okay? And then the temporal lobe is actually encoding kind of the content, the specific details of these particular items that you happen to be processing. And that, in fact, you have a strong coordination and collaboration between parietal kind of slot-like structured representations that tell you the relationships among all the things you're currently processing, and these content representations that exist in the temporal lobe. And that's pretty strange, I think, from a cognitive architecture perspective, to think that you aren't passing around these little chunks of kind of embedded slot filler items, these chunks, but rather the entire brain is kind of representing these things separately in these two different lobes. And I think when you have that idea, it gives you a different sense of what long-term memory is, because in fact, long-term memory can be thought of as everything you know in your parietal lobe, everything you know in your temporal lobe, and you can learn new relationships and automatically apply those new structure and automatically apply that new kind of conceptual structure to existing content representations in the temporal lobe that you already know about, and vice versa. And so it's a compositional turn, so to speak, as Matt's talking about, but of a particular form that may be kind of interesting. And so you think about long-term memory as in a more integrated way, as opposed to being divorced from sensory motor processing, rather being much more integrated with sensory motor processing, coming out of a sensory motor kind of core foundation. And then hippocampus, kind of this episodic memory, is able to bind together these specific content and structure representations. Okay, so a foundation for this comes from work from my colleague here at UC Davis, Charan Ranganath. He's had a lot of evidence over the years showing that there are these two pathways, one highlighted in pink, I guess, here, that he calls the AT network, the anterior temporal network, that really seems to be encoding kind of, as most people think, object information, people, semantic knowledge, this kind of stuff. And we think of that as kind of content. And then really more uniquely and more, really interestingly, the kind of medial parietal pathways, including the posterior cingulate cortex and the retrosplenial cortex, that really seem to encode structure. And he tests this in the context of episodic memory, as we can see in this illustration over here, of kind of schemas or scripts, classic notions of kind of what typically happens across time in a particular situation, like going to a coffee shop. And this involves kind of structured relationships among the particular people, places, things that that are going on in an event, and how they relate to each other. And that's what we mean by structure, is really that kind of schema-like plan or relationship kind of information. And that's illustrated here in this kind of graph-like diagram. So you have both aspects of an overall kind of episode factored into these two separate things. And this is exactly what Fodor and Polishyn, traditional friends of the neural network approach, ironic, that are proposing that you really need to have a specialized system that's really just processing structure, like syntax, for example, independent of content, and that's how the brain, human cognition achieves systematic generative kinds of behavior. And so we've got a new paper coming out, hopefully in Current Directions, highlighting this idea. And so this is a different view of a cognitive architecture that kind of comes out of this overall framework, where you have a separate representation of structure in the parietal networks. And one way to think about structure also is just like a 2D map. We'll get into that in a second. And then you have, again, this other pathway of content. These are really what are supporting this kind of chunk-like, slot-like representations. You have probably actually independent top-down cognitive control. It's obviously coordinated, but really separable pathways in prefrontal cortex interacting with these different posterior cortical pathways for structure and content. And then again, this critical role for the hippocampus kind of in the middle, binding together structure and content to form episodic memories, which then allow you to flexibly reason with these things. And one thing I think that Matt didn't maybe emphasize quite as much about the transformers is that they definitely have this kind of binding like retrieval aspect to them, so they can do pattern completion like hippocampus kinds of processing kind of within each little stack of the network. You've got this kind of lookup table type of binding mechanism that gives you that really important flexible binding ability. Okay, and one way to think about at a very broad level is that the parietal lobe in some large graphical kind of representation of knowledge is representing kind of the links in the graph. Okay, so here we have two different parietal representations representing two different links in some graph representation, and then the temporal lobe is representing the nodes, the content, what's at each kind of point in this graph. And another way to think about that is parietal is allowing you to encode essential transitions between states that are represented in temporal cortex or temporal lobe kind of content pathway. And so these are all different ways of trying to think about kind of the relationship among these kind of structure content pathways. And the idea is, we like to think about a kind of modular, simple kind of thing where you're taking different parts of the brain or processing information and handing it off to another part of the brain. Here, we're doing this really strange thing of putting all of the structure in one part of the brain and all the content in another part of the brain. To get that to work, these things really have to coordinate and work together kind of moment by moment. And so it's a much more interactive, dynamic kind of conception of how things are working, that you're not passing information around, but rather you're coordinating at a very broad level information processing across these two separable streams. Okay. And a lot of this work kind of builds on basic anatomy of the parietal lobe pathway. And so this very nice paper from Kravitz et al. In 2011 articulated three different separable pathways through the parietal lobe. One that's focused on looking, that goes into the frontal eye fields. Up here in green Another one based, that really is important for reaching and kind of peripersonal space that's highlighted in red, going up here to these other kind of motor control areas between parietal and frontal areas. And then the area that I'm going to really focus on, the pathway I'm really going to focus on, and that really is highlighted by Charan's work, is this interesting medial parietal pathway that goes from these areas up here in dorsal parietal into this medial pathway through the posterior cingulate cortex, the retrosplenial cortex, and then into hippocampus through the entorhinal cortex, et cetera. And this retrosplenial cortex is just absolutely fascinating. It's an amazing area. It has very unique genetic signatures. If you have damage to this, you have profound amnesia. It's really a core area for kind of situating yourself in space, and it seems to be very important for spatial navigation. And so here's the kind of idea, is that in fact our cognitive architecture that we have as primates really emerged and evolved from this kind of rodent-like system that is all about navigation, and that medial parietal pathway is really the core upon which our cognitive architecture kind of developed. And it's really involving this collaboration between frontal cortex, parietal, especially that medial parietal lobe, and episodic memory, that those are kind of the core elements of what we really started with. And in fact, the content pathway is kind of an add-on. We literally, I think cognitively, consciously sort of live our mental lives in the semantic content pathway. But in fact, that's, from the rodent perspective, not very well developed and sort of an add-on. And that may be in part why the system is organized in this way, that the core is really parietal, frontal, and hippocampus. And so I'm going to show you quickly a little computational model that we've been working on that's based on the idea of predictive learning. And again, this is an old idea from a neural network perspective, going back to Jeff Ellman. We've recently been looking at how this might be implemented in the brain, and in particular, leveraging these loops from the cortex into the thalamus that involve, we think, a kind of oscillation between a prediction of what's going to happen next that gets sort of projected out onto the thalamus, that is in particular the pulvinar for sensory cortex. That's the area of the thalamus we're talking about. And that you kind of imagine what's going to happen next, and then you see what happens next. And the difference between those two is the kind of source of error-driven learning in the brain, we think, that drives learning in these different pathways. So you're essentially always making a prediction of what's going to happen and learning based on the differences between your predictions and what actually happens. So I'm just going to show a little model here that we developed of these parietal lobe pathways. Let me share my whole screen for a second. And this is a model based on a kind of embodied little agent that's wandering around in a very simple kind of environment here with food and water in these different colored dots. And it's trying to avoid running into walls. And we can kind of configure these elements to create all kinds of different mazes and things, and look at all of the classic results in rodent navigation, et cetera. And the key idea here, though, is that it provides an environment for this predictive learning to essentially anticipate what's going to happen when this little simulated rodent decides to turn left or turn right or move forward. That creates predictable effects in terms of the sensory inputs. And by essentially creating a predictive model of itself and the effects of its actions, the system learns about how the environment works, how its own body works, and how to control that to achieve goals that essentially further the overall reward function of this system. And so it provides a platform for investigating this kind of primordial cognitive architecture, and in particular for seeing what kind of things might emerge in these parietal lobe pathways. And so this is the kind of network driving this thing under the hood. It has all those kind of pathways that I showed you in abbreviated form, we actually didn't include the RSC yet. It's just the PCC, the posterior cingulate cortex, going into motor cortex and driving kind of behavior. One thing that's been taking all my time recently is developing a model here that actually uses discrete spiking. So we're actually doing this error-driven predictive learning now, completely using kind of specific, very standard discrete spiking model. It really does learn very interesting overall representations across these pathways that matches what we see in recordings from these different areas, at least at a qualitative level. And so just to show you what's happening here, you can see it's better to see, kind of temporal integration of the spikes, in fact, a rate code, after all, that shows you the evolution of these representations. And up here, you can see essentially a prediction that's taking place over the pulvinar in this lowest layer of the network about the depth map that's going to emerge as the animal moves around the environment. This is just one of the many sensory modalities that are being predicted here, but it's the easiest to look at. And this is essentially just a full field depth map of kind of like, what am I going to see next in depth from all these different objects. And so that's there's a lot of details here I can't go into, but basically it's just predicting the sensory modalities that are going to come up next. Okay, and then let me just go back to my slides. So the key idea to summarize is that you don't need a allocentric map of the world, as many models hypothesize, to do navigation. All you need to be able to do is predict what's going to happen next. And so the map, so to speak, is really in effect the ability to predict what's going to happen next. And this kind of idea that prediction stabilizes the external world for us, creates a sense of a stable external world, is evident in this really simple demonstration. If you kind of tweak your eyeball with your finger, the world moves. If you move your eyes normally with saccading, the world seems still, right? If we can predict the outcome of our actions, that stabilizes the world. And that's really the key insight here, is that there is no map. There is no sort of actual external kind of internalization of the external world as such. It's just all of these different distributed representations working together to enable us to predict what happens next. That's the map. And by using these kinds of models, we hope to discover kind of what these representations look like. This is what they look like in this model. There's border cells, there's all these different regions, there's turning, there's places where you stop to feed. All these kinds of things have been documented in parietal lobe recordings. And it's just all of these different distributed representations working together that form that ability to predict. There is no kind of single kind of map-like structure. So maps are great to look at, but they're really not a good representation of the world. If you think about like actually having an internal thing that's like a map, where is the center? How does it work? Instead, if you're always representing kind of relative to where you currently are, that's a much more efficient representation. It's always kind of centered on where you are, and you're just predicting what's going to happen next. Okay, so that's the overall idea. My student, Jake Russin, has some really cool models looking at the emergence of this kind of structure versus content representations in the context of this scan task that has been held out as a test of this compositional representations in these deep neural networks. And he showed that by including similar kinds of structural constraints between these two different pathways that are like the parietal lobe versus the temporal lobe, you could get really nice compositional generalization or out of domain generalization in this model. Okay, thank you. And this is all the folks in my lab and collaborators, etc.
Thank you, Randy, for this wonderful talk. We have quite a few questions, and I'm not sure we'll be able to do justice to all of them. So I'm gonna pick a couple that I think are representative. Please feel free to go back to the chat and answer them in the next hour. So I'm going to start with one from Chris Labier, and he's asking, we're getting really to the basic question, does the idea that parietal keeps like this interactive maps that actually point to other nodes in the temporal cortex, does this relate somehow to Smolensky tensor product representations?
Right. I mean, I think, every architecture has some way of solving this slot filler binding problem. So the Smolensky model, and that, it's really the same, as far as I understand it, as the kind of classic holographic reduced representation kind of idea, that you have some way of binding together, some kind of functional role, structural kind of element, the slot that the information belongs to, versus the filler, the content that's actually showing up in that. So yes, it relates to that in that it's solving the same problem. But I think, as opposed to the standard approach of creating a sort of encapsulation of structure and content in a tensor product, of some form, this is really saying that it's an emergent property across these two different pathways. So it's a fairly different kind of way of encoding the information, but it's achieving the same end.
Thank you. We have a question from David Noel, and he's asking, what are the unique predictions that this model actually makes? For instance, asking, is there something that we can expect from parietal lesions, like resulting in selected deficit to compositional scheme?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the tons. So, classic simple example is that if you have damage to a certain region in parietal lobe, you experience this thing called spatial neglect, right? Hemispatial neglect, and there's this amazing thing. You're trying to retrieve from memory where things happen to be located in some place in a city that you're familiar with. You're neglecting out of your memory retrieval stuff that happens to be on the left-hand side of that city, right? Or the famous example of this plaza in Italy, right? And so, how is that possible that like your information about this fundamental stuff that should be bound together in some, chunk somewhere isn't? And in fact, when you try to access that information, if your parietal lobe is damaged, you can't get the kind of spatial aspect of it back out, right? And so I think that shows that the parietal kind of structure, in this case, the spatial structure information, is really dependent. It's all dependent still on the parietal lobe for accessing that information and processing that information. It's not like it's been kind of sequestered into this little chunk and passed off into some other module and stored there. You need the parietal lobe actively to be able to process that information. And so that's a similar, a more general example, would be any other kind of structural knowledge. If you have damage to the parietal cortex that is processing that kind of information, you lose the ability to access and process that information. So it's always needed kind of to process that structural knowledge. That's one big prediction, I think.
That is great. As usual, I like to end with a question that ties into the next speaker. And this is going to be like, I'm going to need a very short answer, unfortunately. But it's a question from Paul Rosenblum. And is asking whether this interpretation of the distinct learning modes or the distinct representation, is it really a difference between models of states, temporal states versus actions, or can be taught as learning like states versus graph structures?
Yes, I think it generalizes. So I think it starts out as kind of, sensory motor prediction about what's going to happen next based on actions and based on things happening in the world. That's how it develops initially. That's the kind of sensory motor foundation. But then it becomes this basis for more abstract reasoning. So when we do kind of abstract thinking about, classic examples of like, Einstein thinking about catching up with a photon as it's escaping from him, these kinds of spatialized representations of abstract concepts, those are kind of higher level abstract uses of these same kind of structure-like representations in parietal lobe, and that we're building these kind of much more complex, like the plot of a novel is this really complex structured graph in our minds. So it's really building up much more kind of high level abstract versions of those same kind of core representations.